The call came late in the year, when waiting had already outlived most of the people who began it. Rosemary Dillon was in her late 80s when the voice on the phone finally spoke her uncle's name with certainty. Private First Class Harry Jerele, identified. She sat at the kitchen table, fingertips pressing lightly against a folder she had kept for decades. "Did we really hear this right?" she whispered. Harry had died in 1942. History had written that down. But somewhere between a prison camp and a cemetery wall, his body became a label. Common Grave 804. Another name drifted beside it, Jacob Morgan, unexplained. How could someone be known to history and still missing to a family? In Berkeley, Illinois, the mornings did not begin with alarms. They began with trains. Long before the sun cleared the low roofs of the neighborhood, steel wheels screamed faintly against rails, a sound that cut through walls and sleep alike. The vibration passed through the floorboards, into the furniture, into the body. For the Jerele family, it was not noise. It was structure. It was how time announced itself. Harry Jerele grew up inside that rhythm. His father, Leopold, worked for the railroad, and the family home sat close enough to the tracks that coal dust and grit settled along the windowsills, no matter how often they were wiped clean. The house itself belonged, in a technical sense, to the railroad. It came with a job, and with it came the understanding that work was not a phase of life, it was life. Harry was one of 7 children. The house was rarely quiet in the way outsiders imagine quiet. There were always footsteps, dishes, voices overlapping. But Harry moved through that noise without adding much of his own. He was known, even then, as the one who didn't speak unless he had something to say. By the winter of 1940, he was 26 years old. He worked with his hands, the way his father had. He knew the weight of metal, the logic of machinery. When he came home from work, his shoulders carried a specific heaviness, the kind that doesn't come from exhaustion alone, but from repetition. He washed his hands at the sink, black residue swirling down the drain, and dried them carefully, as if the day's labor still needed to be treated with respect. In the evenings, after dinner, Harry followed a small routine that never felt like a performance. While his sisters cleared the table and his mother stacked plates, he reached for the guitar. It was not a fine instrument. It had been borrowed, traded, repaired more than once. The wood bore small scratches where fingers had slipped. Harry sat in the same place each time, near the corner of the room, back slightly hunched, head lowered. He did not announce that he was about to play. He simply began. The sound filled the space gently. He sang quietly, never pushing his voice. Sometimes, someone hummed along. Sometimes, no one did. The music did not require participation. It existed the way breathing did present. Steady, unassuming. "Play that again," his sister would say now and then, her hands wet, dish towels slung over her shoulder. Harry nodded once and played it again. Exactly the same. He did not embellish. He did not explain. Music was one of the few places where his inner life surfaced without effort. Another was machinery. When something broke in the house, Harry didn't curse it. He carried it to the table and took it apart. A clock, a radio, a lamp that flickered. He lined the pieces carefully, touching each one, studying how it fit into the whole. He did not rush. If he fixed it, good. If he didn't, he reassembled it anyway. The attempt mattered. In a drawer in his room, beneath neatly folded socks, Harry kept 2 things wrapped in cloth. One was a small camera. The other was a photograph. The camera had traveled with him years earlier, when he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps. Through that work, he had seen parts of the country that still felt unreal when he thought about them. Mountains that rose too sharply to seem permanent. Forests so dense they swallowed sound. He had learned to sleep outdoors, to wait cold, to work until his muscles burned and then keep going. The camera had captured moments he didn't quite have language for. The photograph was simpler. A family gathering. Faces crowded too close together. Smiles caught mid-laughter. Someone's arm draped awkwardly around someone else's shoulder. It wasn't composed. That was why he liked it. He handled both objects carefully, the way one does when something already feels like it belongs to memory. Harry didn't talk often about the future, but it existed in him all the same. After the war, because by then everyone spoke of after the war, as if it were a season that would arrive on schedule, he planned to return to the railroad, save money, buy a better camera, travel again, not because a program sent him somewhere, but because he chose to go. He didn't say this out loud much. Plans spoken aloud could be interrupted. The decision to enlist did not arrive as a speech or a calling. It arrived as a conversation with a friend. Norman Spencer lived nearby, close enough that their lives had overlapped naturally for years. Norman was easier with words. He laughed often, sometimes too loudly, as if filling space made him feel safer. He had habits that revealed him without his noticing. Before leaving the house, he checked his boots twice. When he carried his pocket knife, he sharpened it obsessively, even when the blade was already clean. One evening, Norman stopped by. He leaned against the doorway, hands in his pockets, weight shifting from one foot to the other. "I talked to a guy at the armory," he said, casual in tone, careful not to sound like he was delivering news. Harry was bent over the radio, its casing open, wires exposed. "Yeah?" he said, without looking up. "National Guard officer. Lives across the street from me." Norman shrugged. "They're taking names." The radio hummed softly between them. "I think I'll sign up," Norman added. Harry straightened slowly. He looked at Norman, really looked at him. He thought of the way Norman hated being alone, of the way he checked his boots, like leaving required preparation beyond logic. "If you're going," Harry said after a moment. "I'm going." Norman smiled, relief breaking through before he could hide it. "Don't make me go alone," he said, half joking, half pleading. The armory smelled of oil and dust, old metal and boots that had seen too many floors. Harry and Norman joked about it, calling it just another job, laughing louder than necessary. Papers were signed, names were written down. The act itself felt deceptively simple. On the day of departure, Harry packed carefully. He folded his socks, unfolded them, and folded them again until they sat evenly. He checked the camera, tightened the cloth around it. He hesitated over the photograph, then slid it into an inner pocket, closer to his chest. Norman wrote his name inside his cap, pressed the fabric flat with his palm, as if the act itself could anchor him. At the station, the train waited the way it always had. Same tracks, same sound. But this time, the sound meant leaving. Families gathered close. Hands found shoulders. Embraces began and ended awkwardly. No one sure how long was too long. Harry's mother adjusted his collar, her fingers lingering. His sister tried to smile, and failed, then tried again. 5-year-old Rosemary stood near the doorway. She was small enough that adults blocked parts of the scene. She noticed sounds more than faces. The low voices, the whistle, the scrape of boots on concrete. Harry crouched in front of her. "Be good," he said softly. She nodded solemnly, taking the instruction seriously. Watching his mouth move, not understanding why everyone looked like they were holding something back. "I'll be back," he added, because that was what men said when leaving. The train pulled away. Norman leaned out the window, waving until the platform blurred. Harry watched until buildings gave way to fields, until the familiar became distance. Inside the car, the men settled into a rhythm. Jokes passed between them. Cigarettes were shared. Someone sang off-key. Norman nudged Harry. "When we get back," he said, "we're buying guitars we don't have to borrow." Harry smiled. "Yeah," he said, "that'd be something." They did not talk openly about fear, but it lived in small gestures, in the way hands lingered on objects, in the way conversations skipped certain paths. Harry's concrete fear, dying without anyone knowing where his body was not dramatic enough to share. It stayed private, folded into the careful way he packed, the way he held on to proof of who he was. At home, the house by the tracks grew quieter. The guitar stayed in its corner, untouched. The sound of trains continued, unchanged. Rosemary watched the door for days. It felt like a responsibility, a job she took seriously. Years later, she would say, "He was a very quiet man," and mean that the space he left behind was louder than anything he ever played. The audience might expect the story to turn now toward battle, toward noise and fire. But the real danger had already begun. It was the risk of becoming a name that passed through hands without stopping, of being reduced carefully, bureaucratically, into something easier to file. Harry Jerele left Illinois as a person with habits, plans, and objects that mattered. What followed would test whether any of those things could survive a system not built to hold them. The train kept moving. The track stretched on, and somewhere behind it, a small girl learned how long waiting could last. The heat in the Philippines arrived before understanding did. When Harry Jerele stepped off transport near Fort Stotzenberg, the air felt solid, like something that could be leaned against and still not give way. Sweat appeared instantly, darkening fabric, soaking through layers that had never been meant for the tropics. Men joked about it, loosening collars, laughing in short bursts that sounded forced even to themselves. Someone said they would get used to it. No one did. Time collapsed almost immediately. There was no gradual transition from training to danger. One day, the tanks were being positioned, camouflaged with branches and nets, engines ticking as they cooled. The next, everything was urgent. Harry learned the interior of the M3 Stuart by touch the ridged metal under his fingers, the constant vibration that climbed into his teeth, the smell of fuel that never quite left. Inside the tank, heat pooled and lingered. Sweat dripped into eyes. Hands slipped. He wiped them on his trousers and kept working. On the afternoon of December 8, 1941, the sky itself seemed to turn hostile. The sound came first, rolling and unfamiliar. Then the bombs fell. Survivors would later struggle to describe it, settling on fragments. The swooping whistle of falling bombs, the ripping sound of strafing fire, the way the ground jumped beneath their feet. Harry saw smoke rise from Clark Field as aircraft burned where they had sat lined up hours earlier. The air tasted metallic, acrid, wrong. Whatever illusions remained ended there. From that moment on, days were measured in movement. Fight, withdraw, reposition, repeat. The 192nd Tank Battalion covered retreats, guarded road junctions, held lines long enough for infantry to pass through. Bridges were defended, then destroyed. Harry watched familiar terrain turn into obstacles, and then into nothing. Norman Spencer stayed close. Sometimes they exchanged a look that stood in for conversation. Norman still checked his boots, still ran his thumb along the edge of his pocket knife. Habits survived longer than strength. Lieutenant Raymond Caldwell moved constantly among them. He was in his early 30s, older than most of the men under his command, married, with a child he had barely held before leaving. He carried a small notebook everywhere. Its cover was already soft, corners bent, pages smudged with sweat and grime. Caldwell wrote names. Who was sick? Who was missing? Who could still walk? The pencil stub in his hand grew shorter with each passing week. "If I lose the names," he muttered one night, crouched beside a tank as distant gunfire echoed, "I lose the men." He counted obsessively. Before movement, after movement. Again and again. Numbers became the last form of control. When numbers changed, he wrote them down, pressing the pencil harder, as if pressure could make the fact less fragile. As the retreat funneled into Bataan, the world narrowed. Roads turned to mud. Jungle pressed close. Supplies thinned. Rations were cut, then cut again. Men learned to chew slowly, to swallow carefully, to pretend fullness where none existed. Harry felt his body changing. His belt tightened notch by notch. His hands trembled sometimes, not from fear, but from lack. He noticed it with the same detached attention he once gave broken machines. Something was failing. There were no parts to replace. Disease arrived quietly. Malaria came with fever that burned and froze in alternating waves. Dysentery weakened men until standing felt like an accomplishment. Quinine ran out. Caldwell's notebook filled faster now. Names moved from one column to another. At night, someone sometimes sang. It was never planned. A voice would rise briefly in the dark, barely above a whisper. The song might break halfway through. No one commented. For a moment, it made the world feel less temporary. Harry listened, eyes open, thinking of the guitar at home, of sound that once belonged to evenings rather than survival. By early April, the end was unavoidable. Ammunition dwindled. Fuel disappeared. Orders shifted from holding ground to destroying equipment. When the code word came crash, the tank crews understood. Harry placed his hands on the metal that had carried him through months of fighting. He destroyed the engine deliberately, methodically, as if the act deserved care. On April 9, 1942, surrender arrived. More than 75,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their weapons. What followed did not feel like captivity at first. It felt like movement stripped of purpose. The march began under a sun that punished everything equally. The column stretched for miles. Men walked because stopping meant death. Water was scarce, food non-existent. Guards moved along the line, striking at random. Anyone who fell behind risked being beaten, bayoneted, shot. Harry walked. He focused on small things, the rhythm of his steps, the feel of the ground under his boots. He thought of socks folded evenly, of the weight of the camera in his pack. Though by then most personal belongings were gone, he avoided looking at the bodies along the roadside. When he did look, he did not linger. He survived the march. That fact alone would later sound extraordinary. At the time, it felt arbitrary. Camp O'Donnell was not relief. It was collapse. Men arrived standing and left lying down. Water sources were contaminated. Sanitation was non-existent. Dysentery tore through the camp with terrifying speed. Malaria spread unchecked. Men died sitting upright, waiting for something that did not come. Harry endured. He ate when there was food. He rested when rest was possible. His body weakened steadily, but he remained alive. In the summer of 1942, survivors were transferred again. Cabanatuan Prison Camp Hashone was supposed to ease the overcrowding. In practice, it merely reorganized suffering. The camp was larger, more structured, but no less lethal. The daily ration was lugao watery rice gruel ladled into cups. Men lined up quietly, each hoping their portion might be slightly thicker than the last. Vitamin deficiencies appeared quickly. Pellagra inflamed skin and clouded minds. Beriberi swelled limbs painfully, or weakened hearts without warning. Malaria never left. Pneumonia followed men whose immune systems had been destroyed by months of starvation. Inside the camp, some men refused to let names disappear. One of them was a corpsman known simply as Eddie. He was in his 20s, engaged before deployment. He hid scraps of paper like contraband. On them, he wrote names, dates, burial placements. He folded the papers carefully and hid them in places guards would not think to search. "Don't let them take your name," he whispered to dying men. He washed his hands with almost no water, pretending hygiene still mattered. He gave away his last clean bandage to men he knew would not survive. Each death added to the list. Each list grew heavier. Harry weakened as the year wore on. By December, pneumonia settled into his chest. His breathing became shallow. His body, already stripped of reserves, struggled to fight. He coughed until it hurt to cough. There was no medicine to offer him beyond comfort. On December 28, 1942, Harry Jerele died. He was 26 years old. There was no ceremony. Deaths were processed by day, not by name. Bodies were collected within 24 hours and carried beyond the camp fence. Shallow trenches were dug by men barely strong enough to hold shovels. Multiple bodies were placed together. Common graves. Harry was buried in Common Grave 804. Eddie wrote his name down. Somewhere on paper hidden from guards, Harry still existed. But paper does not stop soil from shifting. When liberation came years later, those secret lists would collide with reality: mixed bones, rotted markers, graves whose boundaries no longer held meaning. The system would search for clarity where none had survived. Back in Illinois, the house by the tracks remained unchanged. Trains continued to pass. Dust still settled on the windowsills. Seasons moved forward without explanation. No telegram arrived with certainty. No body came home. Rosemarie grew older. She learned that adults lowered their voices when certain names were spoken. She learned how waiting could stretch without breaking. Harry Jerele had died in 1942. But something more subtle happened in the years that followed. His identity began to thin, stretched between memory and paperwork, between hidden lists and official records that could not agree. History moved on. Silence took its place. Rosemarie Dillon learned, over time, how to organize waiting. She did not call it that. To her, it was simply what had to be done. Papers went in folders. Folders went in drawers. Drawers were checked the way other people check the weather, out of habit, out of hope, out of a quiet belief that change might arrive without warning. By the time she reached her late 80s, most of the people who had first spoken Harry Jerele's name aloud were gone. Her grandmother had died, never knowing where her son lay. Her mother, Harry's sister, carried the weight longer than anyone should, and then passed it on, unintentionally, the way unfinished things often are. Rosemarie became the keeper. She remembered Harry only as impressions, a quiet presence, A guitar played softly in the evenings. She remembered sound more than face. Over the years, those memories were reinforced not by news stories, but by documents, letters copied and recopied. Official notices that said little. Forms that confirmed only that uncertainty was still official. She kept everything in one place. On some mornings, she opened the folder and checked its contents without reading. Dates, names, unit numbers. The paper smelled faintly of age. She did this the way someone might press a hand to a pulse, just to be sure it was still there. Her fear was not dramatic. It was simple and specific. Dying before the call came. That fear sharpened in her late 70s. Then in her 80s, time became something she measured against paperwork. When the military began reaching out to families of the missing to request DNA samples, Rose Marie hesitated only briefly. The decision felt strange, almost irrational. What could her body possibly offer now, so many decades later? But she said yes. A small vial, a cheek swab, a consent form signed with steady handwriting. She did not tell herself this would solve anything. She told herself only that it would keep the door open a little longer. Her daughter, Sharon Nakamura, watched her do it. Sharon was a veteran herself, disciplined in ways that came from service rather than age. She had grown up watching her mother preserve documents with reverence, as if paper could be sacred. "You're the strongest one in the family," Sharon said once, trying to sound casual. Rose Marie smiled, but she did not feel strong. She felt responsible. While Rose Marie organized memory at her kitchen table, a different kind of work was taking shape thousands of miles away. Dr. Lena Park did not grow up with war stories. She came to them through science. In her late 30s, she worked as a forensic anthropologist with the Defense POW, MIA accounting agency. Her job, as people outside the field often simplified it, involved bones, measurements, data, math. That description never sat right with her. "I don't recover remains," she told her teenage son once, when he asked why she looked so tired. "I recover people." He nodded, unconvinced, and went back to his phone. Dr. Park's office was orderly in the way controlled chaos often is. Case files stacked neatly. Photographs of teeth and bones, printed and labeled. A small sticky note was taped to the edge of her computer monitor. On it, written in block letters, were two words: name first. She drank her coffee black. She read case notes twice. Once as a scientist. Once as a human being. By the time the DPAA launched what became known as the Cabanatuan Project, Dr. Park already understood the moral weight of the work. Hundreds of American servicemen had died in that camp. Many were buried in common graves. Many were later exhumed and declared unknown, when identification proved impossible with mid-20th century methods. The unknowns were not unknown to history, they were unknown to families. The project's goal was both simple and overwhelming. Disinter the unknowns from the Manila American Cemetery and Memorial, and try again. When the case file for Common Grave 804 crossed Dr. Park's desk, it did not look special at first glance. Just a number. A cluster of associated records. A burial roster created secretly by POWs. A list of men known to have died on the same day. She highlighted names as she read. One of them was Harry Jerele. Another was Jacob Morgan. The name collision registered immediately. Dr. Park paused, pen hovering. She had learned to trust that instinct. In her experience, confusion did not announce itself loudly. It hid in places where two things overlapped just enough to be dangerous. She pulled the file closer. Grave 804 had been examined once before. In 1947, investigators had opened it and found at least 4 individuals. 2 were identified successfully. The remaining remains were too heavily commingled to separate with confidence. The decision at the time to declare them unidentifiable had followed the best science available. Dr. Park did not judge that decision. She contextualized it. Technology had limits. So did time. But there was a note that caught her attention. A routing change. A burial plan canceled in 1949. Remains associated with Harry Jerele and Jacob Morgan nearly sent to the United States, then stopped. Returned. Reburied as unknowns in Manila. "Why?" she murmured, flipping pages. Paper did not answer easily. She flagged the anomaly and passed the file to Thomas Keene, a historical analyst attached to the case. Keene was in his 50s, a widower who carried his own quiet losses. He kept a photocopy of his late wife's handwriting tucked into a cookbook at home. He highlighted old memos the way detectives marked crime scenes. Paper is the first battlefield, he liked to say. Keene traced the routing. Fort Mason, San Francisco. A cancellation order with no detailed explanation. The kind of administrative decision that solved one problem by creating another that would last generations. Meanwhile, Rosemarie waited. She labeled folders by year. 1942, 1947, 1949. Each label felt heavier than the last. She checked the phone line more often now, startled by wrong numbers, by telemarketers who did not know what they interrupted. Her fear sharpened again, not of bad news, but of none. When Dr. Park authorized the disinterment of remains associated with Common Grave 804, she did so with caution that bordered on restraint. Commingled remains were the hardest cases. A mistake here did not just fail, it created new harm. Her concrete fear was simple: calling the wrong family. In early 2020, the remains were transported to the DPAA laboratory in Hawaii. Bones that had been buried, exhumed, chemically treated, reburied, and then buried again arrived wrapped and cataloged. Formalin damage complicated everything. DNA strands fractured. Commingling blurred boundaries. Dr. Park stood over the workbench and looked at what remained. "These aren't just samples," she said quietly to a colleague. "These are decisions." They began slowly. Anthropological analysis, age estimates, stature, circumstantial alignment with records. Each step eliminated possibilities without confirming answers. Then DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, offered a narrow but vital path forward. The lab reconstructed fragments using next-generation sequencing. It was painstaking work. Weeks passed with no definitive result. Rosemarie did not know any of this yet. She went on living, cooking, folding laundry, checking folders. She tried not to imagine outcomes. The first failure did not feel like failure at the time. In 1947, 2 years after liberation, men from the American Graves Registration Service stood over the opened earth of what had once been a burial ground outside Cabanatuan. The soil had shifted. Wooden markers had rotted away. What remained were bones arranged by necessity, not by intention. Common Grave 804 did not contain a single story. It contained several, layered together. The examiners worked carefully, but their tools were limited by the era. They measured long bones to estimate height. They examined teeth, hoping for unique dental work. They searched for personal effects, anything that might still speak for the dead. At least 4 individuals were present. 2 could be separated and identified with enough confidence to satisfy the standards of the day. The remaining bones resisted order. Femurs overlapped. Skulls could not be paired reliably with spines. No clear biological boundaries held. The decision was not careless. It was cautious. The remaining sets were declared unidentifiable. They were placed in caskets, labeled unknown, and sent to the Manila American Cemetery and Memorial. Names including Harry Jerele's were instead carved into the walls of the missing. The logic was grim but consistent. Better, an honest, unknown than a wrong answer. For Harry, it was a second disappearance. Dr. Lena Park understood that history not as negligence, but as context. She had spent years reading old AGRS reports, learning their language. Words like insufficient, commingled, inconclusive. They were not excuses. They were boundaries. Still, when she traced the file forward, she stopped at one detail that refused to sit quietly. 1949. A routing order existed, brief, almost casual in tone, indicating that remains believed to be associated with Harry Jerele and another soldier, Jacob Morgan, were to be sent to Fort Scott, Kansas, for burial. Then, just as abruptly, the order was canceled. No extended explanation. No technical appendix. Just a reversal. The remains were rerouted to Fort Mason, San Francisco, and then sent back to Manila to be interred as unknowns. Dr. Park read the line twice. "So, he almost came home," she said softly, "but not as himself." She passed the file to Thomas Keene. Keene sat with it longer than most. He highlighted memos, cross-referenced dates, compared handwriting. His late wife used to tease him about this habit, calling it ghost chasing. "You chase ghosts for a living." she had said once, smiling from the kitchen doorway. He chased this one carefully. The cancellation likely came from a review board. In cases like this, it almost always did. Someone, somewhere, had looked at the evidence and decided it was not strong enough, that burying those remains under a specific name risked something worse than delay. Misidentification. Keene leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The thought settled heavily. If the burial had gone forward, the family would have stood over a grave in Kansas, believing Harry was there. They would have mourned. They would have closed the door. And they would have been wrong. That realization reframed everything. The delay was not simply bureaucratic failure. It was also restraint. Still, restraint came at a cost measured in decades. When the DPAA disinterred the unknowns, tied to Common Grave 804 in early 2020, Dr. Park knew the work ahead would be unlike most cases. These remains had been buried, exhumed, chemically treated with formalin, reburied, and then buried again. Formalin preserved bone structure, but destroyed DNA. It cross-linked genetic material, turning sequences into fragments too small to read with older methods. Commingling complicated everything further. Dr. Park stood over the lab table, gloved hands resting on the edge. The bones were laid out carefully, each piece tagged, photographed, catalogued. She felt the familiar tension settle in her chest, the weight of knowing that precision here mattered beyond science. She picked up a femur gently. The surface was smooth, pale. It fit the hand the way any bone does, indifferent to history. "We go slow," she said to her team. "No assumptions." The early phases yielded little satisfaction. Anthropological analysis narrowed possibilities, but did not confirm identity. Age ranges overlapped. Stature estimates conflicted slightly. Nothing cleanly separated one individual from another. Circumstantial evidence helped, but only to a point. Burial rosters kept secretly by POWs placed Harry Jerele in Grave 804 on December 28, 1942. That mattered. It anchored him to that soil. But anchoring is not identifying. DNA was the only path forward. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down maternally, offered a narrow but resilient thread. Unlike nuclear DNA, it survived better in degraded conditions. But even mtDNA had limits when exposed to formalin. Next-generation sequencing changed those limits. Instead of reading long, intact strands, the technology reconstructed meaning from fragments, thousands of tiny pieces assembled computationally into something coherent. The process was slow. Weeks passed without definitive results. Dr. Park kept working. She drank black coffee late into evenings. She reread notes. She checked results again, unwilling to trust the first sign of alignment. Her promise to herself was unspoken but rigid. She would not call a family unless she was sure. "How sure is sure?" her son had asked once, half joking. Sure enough to live with it, she thought. When the match finally emerged, it did not announce itself dramatically. It appeared as alignment percentages, confidence intervals, data that made sense only after long familiarity. Dr. Park stared at the screen, then leaned back. She felt the familiar mix of relief and dread. Relief that the science had held. Dread because this meant someone would now grieve in a new way. Harry Jerele, matched. The remains from Common Grave 804, long declared unidentifiable, were his. She closed the file slowly. Jacob Morgan's name still sat nearby, unresolved. Its relationship to the grave, partially clarified, but not fully disentangled. The shadow remained. Some questions would survive this answer. Dr. Park understood now why early assumptions failed. It was not that no one had looked hard enough. It was that time, chemistry, and human limitation had conspired to make certainty impossible until it wasn't. She thought of Rosemary Dillon, whose DNA had waited quietly in a database for nearly a decade, whose life had outlasted the science needed to answer her question. When the confirmation call was prepared, Dr. Park did not make it herself. That task belonged to a different role. But she imagined the moment clearly, a phone ringing, a name spoken with finality. The enemy in this story was never just war. It was erosion, of records, of bone, of certainty. And the thin line between honoring the dead and misplacing them forever. Harry Jerele had almost come home wrong. Instead, he waited. And the waiting, however cruel, made the truth possible. The phone call did not feel like an ending. Rosemary Dillon had imagined this moment for so long that when it finally arrived, it carried no familiar shape. It did not sound like relief. It did not arrive as peace. It arrived as disbelief, followed closely by a kind of grief she had never practiced. The voice on the line was careful, measured, trained for moments like this. It said her uncle's name slowly, clearly, as if speaking it too quickly might undo everything. Private First Class Harry Jerele has been identified. Rosemarie sat down without meaning to. Her hand pressed flat against the kitchen table, fingers spread as if grounding herself against the wood. For a moment, she did not speak. Then, she said the only thing that came to her. Did we really hear this right? The question was not skepticism. It was shock. 82 years of waiting does something to certainty. It teaches you that answers rarely stay. The representative repeated the words, gently. Dates, confirmation. December 20th, 2023. Rosemarie nodded even though no one could see her. She felt the tears arrive late, as if they had needed permission. When the call ended, the house was quiet in a way she had not felt before. Not empty, changed. She opened the familiar folder again. The same documents lay inside. The same dates. The same official language that had once meant uncertainty. Now, those pages felt heavier. Not because they contained more information, but because they finally had a boundary. Harry had not been missing. He had been delayed. That distinction mattered more than she expected. Grief arrived first for the people who were not there. Her mother, Harry's sister, who had died with questions folded into her daily life. Her grandmother, who had waited for a son who never returned. Rosemarie had always imagined what it would feel like to tell them, to hand them the certainty they deserved. Instead, she sat alone with it. I'm just sad my mother and his mother weren't here to witness this, she would say later, her voice steady but thin. The sentence carried no accusation, just fact. In the days that followed, the family gathered information the way others gather belongings after a death. Timelines, plans, ceremonies, words that felt unreal until they became unavoidable. For Sharon Nakamura, Rosemarie's daughter, the identification landed differently. Sharon had grown up watching her mother tend to memory with discipline. Papers preserved, stories repeated carefully, never exaggerated. She understood service. She understood uniforms and protocol. What she had never fully understood was the weight of uncertainty that had shaped her mother's entire life. When she saw Rosemarie after the call, Sharon did not ask many questions. She put a hand on her mother's shoulder and said quietly, "You brought him home." Rosemarie shook her head. "Science did," she said. But Sharon knew better. Science had needed someone to wait long enough. The DPAA prepared the repatriation with care. Each step was documented, each date fixed. The remains would return to Illinois in October 2024. Dr. Lena Park received notice of the scheduled ceremony and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. This was the part of the work she never grew used to, the moment when data transformed into consequence. She had seen photographs of ceremonies before. Flags folded. Coffins transferred. But this case lingered. Perhaps because the delay had been so long. Perhaps because she had followed the file through every layer of confusion. She thought again of the 1949 cancellation, of how close the family had come to burying the wrong answer. The truth had waited, but it had waited correctly. As the date approached, Rosemarie prepared the way she always had, through small, practical actions. She sorted clothing. She packed tissues and water, as if for a long drive, rather than a historical moment. She checked and rechecked the schedule. She slept poorly. Her fears shifted now. No longer about never knowing. Now it was about being there in time. About her body failing before the promise was fulfilled. Sharon stayed close. She adjusted details the way she adjusted uniforms quietly, thoroughly, without asking for credit. On October 1st, 2024, the plane touched down at Chicago O'Hare. The tarmac was wide and bright, the wind carrying the smell of fuel and cold metal. A military honors team stood ready. The flag-draped casket emerged slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had learned to move more carefully. Rosemarie watched from a wheelchair. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly. When the casket passed, she reached out. Her fingers touched the flag. It was a simple gesture, a small one, but it collapsed 8 decades into a single moment. The 5-year-old who had watched a door, the woman who had organized waiting. All of it met there, in the pressure of cloth beneath her hand. Sharon stood beside her, one hand steadying her mother's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. Dr. Park watched from a distance, unnoticed, anonymous by design. She did not take photographs. She did not speak. She watched Rosemary's hand on the flag and felt the familiar conflict rise. This was the proof of her work, and also its cost. The burial took place days later at Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery. Full honors, precision, respect. An honor guard member adjusted his gloves carefully before the ceremony began. He was young, younger than Harry had been when he died. His fear was simple: making a mistake, dropping the flag, misstepping in a moment that deserved perfection. The community came. Veterans, motorcycle groups, flags lined the path. The sound of boots on gravel echoed softly. As the flag was folded, Rosemary watched every movement. She did not cry then. She had already cried everything she had. When the folded flag was placed in her hands, it felt heavier than she expected. Later, when the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Rosemary sat quietly. The war, for her, did not end in 1945. It ended there, in that moment. And even then, not cleanly. Because knowing did not return Harry's voice. It did not bring back the man he might have become. It did not undo the years lived in his shadow. It allowed mourning to begin properly. For Dr. Park, the case closed officially. Paperwork completed, files archived. Another name removed from the unknowns. But Jacob Morgan's name still hovered in her mind, unresolved. A reminder that truth often arrived unevenly. That some answers came paired with new questions. For Rosemary, the waiting stopped. The absence did not disappear. It simply changed form. And for the first time, she could lay it down. October arrived without hesitation. The calendar did not slow itself for history, and it did not acknowledge that 82 years had been compressed into a single week. For Rosemary Dillon, time no longer felt abstract. It pressed forward with a firmness she could feel in her joints, in the careful way she stood, in the way each morning carried the quiet urgency of today matters. On October 1st, 2024, the day broke clear and cold in Chicago. The air at O'Hare International Airport smelled of fuel and metal, sharp enough to wake the senses. Wind cut across the tarmac, lifting the edge of jackets and tugging gently at the flags held by the honor guard. Planes moved in the distance, their noise constant, indifferent. Life continued at full speed around a moment that had taken nearly a century to arrive. Rosemary sat in her wheelchair near the edge of the ceremony space. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. Sharon Nakamura stood beside her, one hand always within reach, watching her mother more closely than the proceedings themselves. Neither spoke much. They did not need to. The casket appeared slowly, borne with deliberate precision. The flag draped across it was crisp, its colors bright against the gray morning. Each step taken by the honor guard was measured, rehearsed, controlled. One of the guards, a young man barely into adulthood, adjusted his gloves as he moved. He had practiced this motion dozens of times. Still, his heart beat hard. His fear was not of the crowd or the cameras. It was of making a mistake in front of someone who had waited her entire life for this moment. He glanced once toward Rosemary, and then fixed his eyes forward. The casket passed. Rosemary lifted her hand. The motion was slow, careful, as if speed might fracture something fragile. Her fingers trembled slightly as they reached out. When her hand touched the flag, she inhaled sharply, the breath catching in her chest before releasing. The fabric was cool beneath her skin. It was real. For a brief second, her eyes closed. In that space, the years collapsed. The house by the tracks. The sound of a guitar played softly so as not to interrupt conversation. A door watched too long. A folder opened and closed until the motion became ritual. Sharon felt her mother's hand tighten against the fabric and placed her own hand over it, steadying, anchoring. "I've got you," she murmured. Rosemary nodded once. Across the tarmac, Dr. Lena Park stood apart from the family, deliberately anonymous. She had not planned to attend. She rarely did. But something in this case had unsettled her from the beginning, and she had needed to see the consequence of the work with her own eyes. She watched Rosemary's hand on the casket, and felt the familiar, uncomfortable truth rise again. This was not closure. It was accounting. The remains were transferred. The ceremony concluded, the plane departed, and yet nothing felt finished. 3 days later, at Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery, the ground waited. The cemetery was quiet in the particular way. Places of honor are quiet, not empty, but restrained. Rows of markers stretched outward, names and dates aligned with military precision. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing against one another. Rosemarie arrived early. Sharon checked the seating, adjusted blankets, offered water, all the small actions that mattered, more than words. The honor guard assembled again. The young guard adjusted his gloves once more, slower this time. He reminded himself to breathe. The ceremony began. Commands were spoken. Boots moved in unison. The flag was lifted, folded, handled with care that bordered on reverence. Each fold erased something of the larger cloth, transforming it into a compact shape meant for hands rather than coffins. Rosemarie watched every motion. She did not look away. When the folded flag was placed into her hands, it felt heavier than she expected. Not because of its weight, but because of what it contained. Years, silence, waiting, all compressed into fabric and gesture. She held it close, resting it against her chest. Sharon knelt slightly beside her. "You don't have to hold it forever," she whispered. Rosemarie shook her head. "Just a little longer." The burial proceeded. Earth met earth, a name finally aligned with a place. Around them, the community stood in quiet support. Veterans in worn jackets, flags held upright, members of motorcycle groups forming lines of respect, faces that had never known Harry Jerele personally, but understood the shape of his loss. The sound of taps followed, clear and piercing. The notes hung in the air longer than expected, as if reluctant to fall. Dr. Park stood near the edge of the gathering. She did not wear a badge. No one recognized her role. She was there simply as a witness. She thought of the lab, of bone fragments laid out under bright lights, of data reconstructed from pieces too small to understand on their own, of the responsibility that came with choosing when certainty was enough. She had promised herself never to call a family unless she was sure. Now, she watched a woman hold a folded flag and understood the weight of that promise in a new way. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Rosemarie remained seated for a moment. The cemetery returned gradually to its quiet order. Sharon waited without rushing her. "I thought it would feel like the end," Rosemarie said finally. Sharon tilted her head. "Does it?" Rosemarie looked down at the flag in her hands. "It feels like the right place to stop waiting." That night, back at home, Rosemarie placed the flag carefully on the table. She did not put it away immediately. She sat across from it and allowed herself to look without flinching. There were still things she would never know. What Harry's voice sounded like as a grown man. Whether he still sang in the camp, whether he thought of home near the end, or if hunger and fever stripped even that away. Whether he felt afraid. Those details were gone. What remained were specifics. A date, a grave, a name spoken correctly. Dr. Park returned to her office days later and closed the case file. She filed it where closed cases belonged. Still, Jacob Morgan's name lingered in her thoughts, unresolved. A reminder that even successful identifications left shadows behind. Some questions would outlive answers. Rosemarie slept better than she had in years. Not because the story had ended cleanly, but because it had ended honestly. The house by the tracks was quiet now. The sound of trains still passed through the night. Dust still settled. Time continued its work. But for the first time, the waiting was no longer part of the routine. Harry Jerele was home. What remained was not absence, but memory anchored at last to a place that would not shift. Harry Jerele's name no longer lives only in stone among the missing. It rests in the ground now, aligned with a date, a place, and a flag folded by careful hands. For the first time since 1942, his story occupies physical space. And yet, nothing about the decades in between can be returned. Rosemarie Dillon no longer waits for the phone to ring, but the shape of waiting remains part of her. It lives in the birthdays that passed without explanation, in the mothers who died still believing tomorrow might bring news, in a childhood memory that had to last a lifetime. Knowing did not erase those years. It simply gave them an ending. For Dr. Lena Park, The file is closed, but the lesson is not. The name Jacob Morgan still sits in the margins of history, a reminder that identity can slip sideways as easily as it can disappear. One administrative decision, one assumption made too early, and a family might mourn the wrong truth forever. This is what remains after science does its work. Not triumph, not finality, just a quieter understanding that absence shapes lives even when answers arrive, and that being found does not undo the cost of being lost for so long. Harry came home. The echo of his absence will always arrive first.